The subject of this video is well captured in the concept of the broken window theory, which stipulates that, like dominoes, one broken window will lead to another, and which will lead to another, and then the entire area will be brought into a state of decay via broken windows. There's a similar parable about king losing his kingdom over one of a horseshoe, which seems applicable. Now, this state of decay that we find today through the broken window theory is enforced through trespassing regulations, which are fraudulently set up based off of the constitutional clause of protection of life, liberty, and property, or not being deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And these trespassing law regulations, fraudulently called laws, form the basis for mask mandates, where the police will enforce it, as I found out when I called them and asked if they were going to enforce mask mandates. They said no. But, always a but, they said on the phone call that I made that if you went somewhere, even public buildings, and you refused to put on a mask, well, then the people there would ask you to leave, and if you didn't leave, then you're trespassing, and that is what they would enforce. But when it comes to trespass on property, the state of decay is enforced using this fraudulent statute or regulation, because a company will come along through some distant benefactor that lives very far away, and they'll buy property. And then that company will put up trespassing signs that it's private property. And then they won't sell it, and they'll leave it abandoned. And the police will physically enforce this state of decay to bring down property value. This is a tactic that is being used, and it all revolves around property value. So the police, physically speaking, enforce the state of decay, and the state of decay is intended to crash property value so that companies can come in, swoop in, and buy up the property, and then start work on their abandoned building or buildings and bring the property value up, which is a very vicious technique to use for economic purposes. And naturally, it flies in the face of salvage, the law and concept of salvage, which is the idea that if something is left abandoned, then it is open to be salvaged. And naturally, you don't see people putting up private property access on cars in a junkyard, although the junkyard itself might put them up. But it is interesting the way that these trespass regulations, fraudulently based off of a clause in the Constitution, are used against the idea of salvage to ensure that corrupt companies and the people that run those companies specifically can crash the property value around an area. In this context, the alleged incident with Martha's Vineyard is applicable for exposing for a perspective of these types of people that have enforced and set up this trespass concept and the enforced state of decay to bring down property value in an area and ensure that those people that live in that area are in poverty. And this incident gives us a perspective about property value and what lengths they would go to protect their property value, and also how they see people. Now, Martha's Vineyard, unlike the name suggests, is not actually a vineyard, but an island. And it is full of so-called wealthy elites, even though they're not elite. And the only wealth that they would have attained likely is from fraud. And this place gives us, or this incident that is alleged to have taken place here, gives us a perspective of the two faces of the same coin, meaning that while they pretend to be on opposite sides, both sides are actually working together. And in this context, we can find this because of the way that they view human beings. These people see human beings as livestock, and there is no side that is good, basically. Because while one side is transporting humans like they're livestock, the other side is viewing them as trash that will bring down their property value, basically. Other human beings, that's how they see other human beings. And this is reflected in all of the fraudulent COVID measures that pop up around the place, and how people are corralled when it comes to travel, and the whole system, the whole travel monopoly system and the visa system and all these other things are designed for corralling human beings, and their purpose is present in the environment that is constructed. The environment, of course, bears striking resemblance to certain past environments that some of us are taught about, but perhaps not enough. But this idea of manipulating the environment for property value goes so far beyond in the different techniques for manipulating perception. And once you manipulate the environment, you can manipulate habits, which is the concept behind controlling the environment for behavior modification in the school system. And that, of course, is reflected in the different psychological operations that are conducted today. And then even in architecture, we find this concept of environment regulation and control to affect behavior and to control perception. And practically speaking, there are many methods or many institutions that enforce this environment, and of course those would be the environmental protection agencies, whose purpose is to protect broken environments, certainly not fix anything. But this still goes even farther beyond simply protecting decay, because when it comes to things like the lead paint warnings and campaign to remove lead paint from houses and walls and other places, this goes even deeper, this concept of environment manipulation, which leads, of course, to sabotage and weakening for the purpose of future destruction plans, or future plans of destruction. And, of course, it's the Environmental Protection Agency which pushes the whole thing about lead paint. And we can see the objective behind these attempts to ban lead paint, which were, as it appears, mostly successful, in the concept of the Faraday cage. Now, it's interesting when you search these terms, Faraday cage, if you don't search cage of non-conductive metal, and you search Faraday cage instead, you'll get something interesting. So first, let's look at what a Faraday cage actually is. And on beprepared.com, it states that a metal-clad box, ammo boxes, and toolboxes with a tight enough seal can make great Faraday cages. Any box made of non-conductive material, such as plywood, and then totally covered with metal mesh, or metal screening can serve as a Faraday cage. Notice it is a box of non-conductive material, like lead paint. Lead is not conductive. Lead's not conductive. In fact, lead blocks radio frequency, so your cell signal will not penetrate lead. And that is the reason for the removal of lead paint. Now, interestingly, if we Google, or we search, this is DuckDuckGo, Faraday cage, we get a completely opposite definition. And Wikipedia, obviously written by some sort of brain-dead professor, states that Faraday cage or Faraday shield. Oh, here we go with the moving words. So stupid. Is an enclosure used to block electromagnetic fields. A Faraday shield, and here they're using their new word. See, they're trying to shift the vocabulary. May be formed by a continuous covering of conductive material, or in the case of a Faraday cage, by a mesh or such materials. Faraday cages are named after blah blah blah. And the one below it says that a Faraday cage is just an electronic isolation chamber. And the last one says a Faraday cage is a protective enclosure that prevents certain types of electromagnetic radiation from entering or exiting. So all of these responses are attempting to obfuscate and to subvert and to distract from what is in reality a Faraday cage, which is something that is not conductive and protects against radio frequency and other things like that. Now, even when we go to OSHA, an allegedly governmental outfit, which ironically has a torch for their symbol on the OSHA Academy. No surprise there, the torch of education. It's a reference to an earlier video I did where I talk about how the education system's job is to put the torch of education onto the bonfire of knowledge. But in their little excerpt, they talk about sources of lead, which is interesting because all of their sources are man-made, which couldn't be sources of lead. Because the lead in those things has to come from somewhere, right? So they state that non-glossy vinyl mini blinds from foreign countries contain lead. Yeah, from foreign countries. Drinking water, children's jewelry and toys, indoor and outdoor gun ranges. That last one let's focus on, with the indoor and outdoor gun ranges. Now, why would they want to use the alleged dangers of lead for ammunition? And mind you, before we look into the reason why they're trying to ban lead with guns, just remember that lead is found in mountains. So lead naturally is found in mountains. That's the source, that's the original source of lead. And yet, lead bullets are bad for the environment. Now, what would be an actual purpose for that? Well, that's actually really simple. It is to remove the ability to reload. You see, if you can't reload bullets, then it doesn't matter how many guns you have. And if they shut off the manufacturing of ammunition, which they control, then you'll be throwing sticks and stones, basically. Now, this concept of environment manipulation for defensibility purposes was well known in the past, perhaps less known today, but there are some areas where we can find the importance of structures like earth berms or earthworks, a earthen bulwark. And these are the best protection that you'll ever get against bullets. Also, when it comes to modern construction materials, with the manipulation of our environments, of course, their stuff is always built robust. But when it comes to our things, well, our houses are made out of tissue paper. They're cheaply made but expensive to purchase. They are also not very well insulated in the winter, and not very well breathable or cool in the summer. But they also will stop absolutely nothing in a catastrophe, and they're very indefensible, which is the purpose. Now, with this context of intentional environment manipulation, with the concept and the objective of weakening and enforcing a state of decay, I wrote a series of papers that were presented at the University of Nebraska-Kearney. For the first one, analysis of 3 countries considered highly, moderately, and poorly developed. I stated, quote, introduction. The development of countries is a question that has no direct answer. It requires a proper defining of terms to understand what we are working with and whether the picture is accurate. First, the countries on this list are the recognized juridic entities that have been incorporated into the United Nations, and the numbers presented in these models would be inherently faulty. Therefore, such a circumstance might not correctly represent the practical situation of these places. The data taken here will only reflect the areas in which these governments retain control. It is almost impossible to practically measure the situation of Africa using the primary models of most funded outlets. Now, mind you, as a note, the word government here is being used to address a corporate entity that is fraudulently operated under the name government or the title. We don't have any governments today, we have incorporated entities, which I mentioned earlier in this paragraph. In continuation, this is because the people of Africa categorically resist foreign influence in many parts. The same can be said for certain parts of America where faulty information will be given to poll and census workers specifically because these outlets are not trusted. Whenever there is a financial interest involved, the numbers presented here cannot be accurately verified. A similar situation can be found in the corporate society of today. Numerous workers will call in sick in order to gain time off while they are not physically ill. If sick call numbers were used, it would suggest that more people are sick than actually are. A similar situation can be found with plague numbers in the Middle Ages, when poor country knights would claim the plague to keep a passing king and his retinue from consuming their winter stores. This and many other elements mean that numbers alone should not be trusted, but corroborating evidence should be presented. This is what I will attempt to do in this paper. Tanzania. The country of Tanzania has a history that is similar with other African nations, named the Sultanate of Zanzibar. We find a description of the late 19th century Tanzania, which is all too familiar for the continent of Africa. As with today, Africa was full of mercenary forces at the turn of the century, presenting the interests of one corporate organization or another. The previous governor of Sofala, a Portuguese man by the name of Alfredo Brandão Cruz de Castro Ferreira, gives us a first-hand account of Zanzibar at the time. Brandão A. 1884. Quote, the port was filled with ships, some were English war vessels, others pertained to the Sultan. Some steamers were destined for commerce, recreation boats for the Sultan, and many pangaios de moros. Now, the book further details the foreign involvement in early Tanzania, but the presence of English warships in the port of an allegedly independent sultanate is very telling. With this in mind, we can imagine the view that so-called Tanzanians might hold toward their alleged government. As the United Nations is based in Europe and the government of Tanzania is incorporated into the United Nations, it is not such a leap to expect a degree of resistance from the local populace. The mainstream outlook toward Tanzania is demonstrated in the numbers presented here, which are not very flattering. According to the 2021 World Population Data Sheet by the Population Reference Bureau, Tanzania is a less developed country, with it listed at a 19% birth rate to mothers aged 15 to 19. This statistic is often pointed to as representing a poorly developed country, joined by an infant mortality rate at 32 and an HIV rate of 1.1 in males and 2.2 in females aged 15 to 24. Of course, consider there are large portions of unregistered locals in Tanzania. One wonders where this data originates. Mexico. The Republic of Mexico is considered a middle developed country according to the 2021 World Population Data Sheet by the Population Reference Bureau. This is listed as having an infant mortality rate of 13 and a rate of birth to mothers 15 to 19 as 15. However, HIV statistics is listed at 0.1 for men and less than 0.1 for females. Using these statistics, it would be argued that healthcare is better in Mexico, suggesting that public health facilities are to be applauded. This is because the HIV rate seems to be relatively low for Mexico, but many factors could relate to this number, if this number is even to be believed. The fact is, one way or another, Mexico is home to a wide range of diverse populations. As with Tanzania, the federal Mexican government is incorporated into the United Nations, and only a truly dishonest person would suggest that the Mexican people adore their alleged country. As an example, in many ways, the city of Merida is cleaner than most U.S. cities, and the United States is listed as a well-developed country. Furthermore, natural medicine is prized in the Yucatan and other parts of Mexico, which is evident in the number of natural food stores and local herbal medicine options. These types of outliers would present a problem for the numbers presented here, as only the infant mortality rate of hospitals or governmental numbers would be easily collected by this bureau. The fact is, many would give birth through the assistance of an unlicensed midwife, and if the baby died, it would not be reported to authorities, who would lock up the offenders for practicing without a license. In this state, and with the unpopular situation of their government, it cannot be believed that the numbers presented here are true and accurate. Spain. When it comes to Spain, it is no surprise that this country is listed as a superiorly developed country. The obvious trend in these numbers presents a skewed bias towards countries in the northern hemisphere. The infant mortality rate is listed at 2.7, with HIV rate set at below 0.1 for both men and women. Lastly, the birth rate to mothers aged 15 to 19 is listed at 2. Extremely great numbers are presented here for Spain. One must wonder where this information is truly derived and what sets Spain apart from Tanzania or Mexico. Assuming these numbers are mostly true, with a small margin for error, we might look at history and location to get a better sense of the question. First, Mexico and Tanzania are considerably larger than Spain. Also, Spain has a more cooperating populace to the current global regime that exists today. However, the most likely cause of Spain's numerical good fortune is their proximity and ties to the United Nations, such as demonstrated in the President of the United Nations in 2018. Despite the woman being listed as a delegate of Ecuador, she was born in Spain. Born in Salamanca, Spain, Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garces was the President of the United Nations General Assembly from 2018 to 2019. She worked closely with the highly unpopular President of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, and was a key member in the Yasuni National Park Initiative. Summary. The listed countries represent an example of the situation that corporate globalism has put the world in today. When administering and analyzing data, one must look at the situation as a whole, not only the physical geography, but also the way the system operates, and analysis of patterns is paramount. The numbers presented in this data sheet would suggest a better standard of living for those in the northern hemisphere. Using corroborative evidence, we can establish the observation that countries in the lower hemispheres are used to benefit those in the northern hemisphere. The wealth is extracted from places like Mexico and Tanzania to benefit regions like Spain and those closer to the United Nations. This would show that the corporate globalism of today is both detrimental and beneficial, depending on which perspective is being served. Simply put, countries developed for the United Nations will not benefit from this type of globalization, but those that have closer ties to the United Nations will. However, categorically, the human people will not benefit from this form of globalization. It is important to answer the question of whether or not a country can develop without the benefits of globalization. This is because it would entirely depend upon the perspective and for whom a country is being developed. And then I post my references, which is Brandão A. 1884, personally translated from Portuguese, de Lisboa a Moçambique, Cartas a M.A.G. Brito Fernandes sobre uma viagem à costa oriental da África, from page 125, a bordo do Java, 13 de dezembro de 1880. Population Reference Bureau 2021 World Population Data Sheet from the sections on Eastern Africa, Central America, and Southern Europe. Volcanoes, climates, and water stress. Where and what are they? Introduction. Defining terms will be necessary when answering these question prompts. In the interest of being accurate and to avoid any ethical lapses, we must accurately and precisely understand the terms that we shall be working with. These terms include the words climate, volcanoes, earthquakes, and water stress. First, we will address the term climate, which has become one of the more difficult terms to define due to shifting of word meanings over the past decade. Climate bears a similar origin as the term clime, a term which is used to refer to an obsolete Greco-Roman view of the world. Climes were inhabited portions of a spherical world, and the customary word use of this in a geographical sense can be found in the Marine Corps hymn, where it states, "Marines can be found in every clime and place where we can take a gun." Of course, many use the word climate today to explain a state of being, and this meaning is used is applied in a geographic sense as well, such as Wordnik's definition, where it states that climate is the meteorological conditions including temperature, precipitation, and wind that characteristically prevail in a particular region. We also see the word climate used in other senses like a political or social climate. Next, we look at the word volcanoes and earthquake, which are somewhat easier to define. In a geographic sense, some academic geographers might consider volcanoes to be hot points that are caused by the division in tectonic plates, which correlate to earthquakes. In the academic geographer's mind, due to their definition of the shaking forces caused by shifting of tectonic plates. Of course, we run into trouble here, as many unnaturally occurring events can cause shaking in the ground, a force which will be referred to as an earthquake. Therefore, it appears the working definition of earthquake should be a strong shaking in the ground. Finally, we will look at the term water stress, which is a term that seems more localized in the area of geography and less likely a target for obfuscation and misinterpretation. Water stress appears to refer to the places in the world that have a lack of water. However, this term can get a bit tricky, as many places can lead to areas that are classified as water stress. But the water stress occurred does not fit the definition used. We will need to look further at these terms to discover what they truly relate. So let's get started. Volcanoes and earthquakes. A volcanic line of a sort appears to develop when one looks at a map. Specifically, this can be seen in the presence of volcanoes from Chile, Ecuador, up through Mexico and into California and Hawaii. All of these places are known for volcanoes, at least off the Pacific coast of the Americas. Of course, there are also volcanoes in the Atlantic, and some can be found around the Himalayas. There are also underwater volcanoes, and these formations seem to not be relegated to any specific region of the globe. Naturally, the eruption of Pompeii is the most well-known volcanic event in Greco-Roman history, and that of the allegedly modern school system. Possibly, Pompeii is even more well-known than the more recent eruption of Mount St. Helens, but that is debatable. Either way, there is much more that needs to be studied and understood about volcanoes, but most academics will define volcanoes in a certain manner. The National Geographic defines volcanoes in the academic standard, National Geographic 2022. A volcano is an opening in a planet or moon's crust through which molten rock and gases trapped under the surface erupt, often forming a hill or a mountain. However, we get into some trouble with earthquakes. Some seismic activity, which does not fit the standard academic definition, might be referred to in the context of an earthquake. It is often believed that earthquakes cause tsunamis, such as with the one that struck Japan during the Fukushima incident. Yet, if we use the standard definition, this might not be the case, as seismic activity can be produced by explosions, such as subterranean eruptions and the detonation of undersea bombs. Other things can lead to seismic activity that might cause an earthquake, but does not relate to the standard definition. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration defines earthquakes as an earthquake is an intense shaking of Earth's surface. This shaking is caused by movements in Earth's outermost layer. Of course, this is a rudimentary definition, but would suggest that most earthquakes must be found along fault lines and nowhere else. Since the National Aeronautics and Space Administration is considered an authority on this subject, their definition provides the end to the discussion. Correct? No, we would be dishonest to say that the so-called authorities are correct, simply because they retain a position or title. We should explore the different possible relations to the earthquakes and what might be a more fitting definition. However, for the sake of brevity, we shall leave this subject here. According to most academicians, earthquakes and volcanoes should be found at fault lines or breaks in the alleged crust of the Earth. Climates, continental and maritime. The obsolete idea of clime does not incorporate the idea of continental and maritime climates, so these might be more modern innovations on the idea. To understand these concepts, we should attempt to define continents, but this is not so easy. The continents of the Americas and Africa would suggest that a continent is mostly a separate landmass. Yet the alleged continent of Europe is separated from the Asian continent on paper, to which it is directly connected and not practically separate. This throws confusion onto the definition of continent, which appears to be applied loosely to a major landmass, but the true separations appear to be purely arbitrary. Regarding the topic at hand, we might readily define a continental climate as relating to landmass, while maritime climates relate to the sea. although these may not be standard academic definitions. Unfortunately, some academics define climate with overly complicated language, such as this response from an alleged history professor on Quora. Quote, maritime climates juxtapose the climatic effects of the land and the sea, resulting in a kind of dynamic equilibrium in coastal areas. Therefore, in understanding the simple idea of climate, we can say that most coastal regions enjoy a sort of mix between maritime and continental climates, in addition to island regions. As an example, it might be argued that the Caribbean islands enjoy a maritime climate, while the inland portions of North America are subject to a continental one. Still, this definition is somewhat ineffective, as the climate of New York is vastly different from that of the Caribbean. New York City, despite being on the coast and intricately connected with the ocean realm, retains the so-called four seasons, while the Caribbean does not. In this definition, New York City might be a truly applicable example, where the islands of the United Kingdom might provide a better motif. However, as I have personally experienced the climates of northeast coast of the United States and that of the Caribbean, I can personally attest to the validity of the aforestated description, whereas I have not visited the so-called British Isles. Water stress. Brandau A., 1884, describes a place that can be considered as having water stress in terms of the ecosystem versus the water supply. It would be hard to argue that there is a problem with the water supply in the Suez Canal. Yet what is explained describes a place that has water stress in the ecological sense. Although this is not entirely straightforward, as there is a vast supply of water in the Suez Canal and there are many surrounding bodies of water that can provide resources to the area. One must ask themselves, why, with so much water supply, is the area around the Suez Canal so barren? This very question is alluded to in this passage. Whomever enters the canal for the first time will suffer a great disillusion. Almost all fantasize about a long canal with beautiful homes and gardens on the banks and believe will observe on their trip the panorama of the Mississippi or other rivers of America. None of this. The aridity of the desert, the vast sea of land on the two sides causing us to see those horrible tempests known by the name simoon that have buried so many caravans. Strangely, we find a similar situation in California, which, despite being next to the Pacific Ocean, continually suffers from a lack of water supply for human consumption. Meanwhile, other arid places are considered to have ecosystem-based water scarcity, but do not suffer from shortages in the water supply for consumption. Of course, water stress can be found in many places, including Africa, the Middle East, the Orient, the Americas, and Australia, among many other places. Oddly enough, continental Europe seems to contain no places that suffer from this issue. It is difficult to say which climate regions have more trouble with water stress, since this can be found in the Gobi Desert and the Mojave, both by changing climates in the northern hemisphere, while the Arabian sands and those of the Atacama Desert can be found in completely separate climate regions. Summary. The listed terms are not so straightforward to define. In this paper, an attempt is made to accurately define these terms of volcano, earthquake, climate, and water stress. Unfortunately, these terms and ideas are sometimes taught as concrete and unchanging facts. Yet, our world is interactive and is constantly changing. Usually, liability for the state of the world today is shifted toward humanity, and away from the corporations that have perpetrated most changes today. We can look at history and the lush nature of the Americas for evidence of this. Toxifying soil, industrialized farming, and other corporate policies and practices have led to many environmental catastrophes, such as the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, which was reportedly caused by industrial farming and overtaxing the environment. However, there is a clear contrast in the lush places that are populated by mostly unincorporated indigenous populations who live in harmony with their environment rather than polluting, poisoning, or otherwise maiming it. On the other hand, environmental destruction is often caused by aggressors against their enemies, such as the scorched earth tactics of European military forces, the draining of the Iraqi wetlands by Saddam Hussein's regime, and the melting of mountain ice caps by the Indian military in Pakistan during Operation Whitewash. These circumstances and many other elements make it extremely difficult to define terms that are not so straightforward, which is necessary to honestly respond to the proposed questions. Next, categorizing a political system, an analysis of political theory and how it relates to chess. Introduction. The game of politics is similar to chess, and politics has become synonymous with power. A politique, at one point, might have meant the populace of a region. However, today, to engage in politics, one must engage in the realm of intrigue, competing against another opponent for a position of power. The most apparent difference between chess and politics is that the political realm could incorporate more than one opponent, while chess is a two-person game. Of course, with politics, it does not take two to do the proverbial tango. Instead, an unopposed powermonger will be considered a de facto ruler, dominating the conquered realm by the fact of simple presence. In this way, the political game ropes many reluctant players into rigged systems, saying that if one does not engage, then another will be forced upon them. Here it will be said that silence is acquiescing to the domination of another. Because of these ideas, most today are tricked into the scheme that we call politics. Recognition of players in political chess. Modern political classification generally only recognizes certain players on the chessboard of modern politics. The propaganda of corporate structures today refuses to recognize the place of natural individuals. Instead, they see only the position of corporate structures and entities. On the main board, the natural public, or natural populace, are only considered as pieces on the political board. Natural individuals are not recognized as players within most recognized political systems. Conversely, a natural system will not recognize the sovereignty of fictitious entities, like corporations. These two separate categories are diametrically opposed to one another, but they do present two overarching spheres of political systems. The unnatural or legal entity presents the main area of politics today. However, historically, the natural realm of politics dominated the fictitious around the globe. Today, the idea of natural system is barely seen or recognized, let alone classified in textbooks of the unnatural political realm. When it comes to chess, many strategies might be employed, but the rules of the game will still apply to every player. Otherwise, the game is no longer considered chess. One of the rules of life is that freedom is required for certain political mechanisms to be effective. This is a paradox, especially when the ultimate objective is not freedom. This conundrum is insinuated in Thinking About Hybrid Regimes by Larry Diamond. Quote, if, following Samuel Huntington, a system is democratic when it is most powerful, collective decision makers are selected through fair, honest, and periodic elections in which candidates freely compete for votes. What constitutes fair, honest, and free elections? Now, while the author might go on to answer this question differently, the matter remains that freedom must be afforded to those that seek power. You see, if a would-be tyrant is blocked from conquest, it means that not enough freedom has been provided to that tyrant, which is entirely a practical matter. Here, the operative word is power, and political scientists classify the strategies or political systems that relate to the game of power. If power and domination are not sought, then a different game is being played, and the categorized strategies might not apply. The old Osage government is one of those few structures that cannot rightly be considered a government. Unfortunately, when classifying governments, all miscellaneous structures have to be fit into the proverbial power game box. Simply put, no other structures can be recognized in political classification besides those that desire power. Even in the few systems that have no power acquisition in their design, political scientists must refer to these structures within the power dynamic. To do any different would recognize the existence of a different game, if you will. Find an example of this in Lewis F. Burns's Osage Indian Customs and Myths. Quote, to forestall any seizure of total power by either or both chiefs, the little old men carefully confined the duties and powers of the chiefs. The 12 duties and powers could be placed on a list. This third edition of the book has many other examples of clear edits and injected words that were not of the authors. In this example, note the words power, seizure, and total. A peace-loving Osage himself, Lewis Burns, was not prone to using these words. This is a clear representation of a hidden hand practicing the trade of an all-too-familiar enemy, the propagandist. Even here, where the passage talks about the village of elders choosing someone for a specific position, the unknown writer cannot refer to the system in any other terms besides acquisition of power. However, none of the Osage elders had the acquisition of power in mind, as they were simply the older generation of a village. Instead, they simply decided that a position must be occupied and stated what the responsibilities of that position were. Responsibility and power are two diametrically opposed terms. A public elevation, due to socializing propaganda, is seen as a position of power. The majority today see only the ability to dominate others as a worthy objective in life. The selfless viewpoint of responsibility is rarely regarded in most spheres and cannot be classified as such in any political context. The game of politics is the game of power. Conversely, positions of duty and responsibility will rarely be seen as a game, although they could be. Essentially, most will see responsibility and duty as something to be avoided, like washing the dishes, taking out the trash, or taking care of others. Most will see these positions as a means to an end rather than seeing an altruistic good for all as the outcome. This is usually solidified through bribes, like offering children a reward for doing what is considered work, like the aforementioned tasks. This dynamic can be found most evident with grave consequences in the military. Those would-be petty dictators are the ones that seek positions of elevation, like a superior rank. They see this as a stepping stone or climbing a rung on the path to greater power. They are driven by the desire to dominate and gain a superior position, as they are engaged in the game of power or politics. Opposite this viewpoint, few are elevated that view a higher rank as a position of responsibility to others. Instead, such individuals will look at a bigger picture and understand their position is necessary to the lives of others and not only themselves. Unfortunately, such individuals do not campaign for promotion and are rarely selected for it. The presidency and office of Donald J. Trump. The office and presidency of Donald J. Trump is very different from the celebrity apprentice version of Donald Trump. Many will say that Donald Trump is a dictator, simply regurgitating something overheard, no doubt. Perhaps they are right. The celebrity apprentice shows the visage of a dictator, reveling in the phrase, "You're fired." On the other hand, one could look at a celebrity apprentice and the businessman Donald J. Trump as examples of responsibility, where duty to one's company and employees is held above all else. Either way, the office of President Donald J. Trump presents something greater than any one man or company. It represents a shifting in the power dynamic, and is evidence of a changing in the guard, in an overall sense. First, most will view the man in the position of president, likely with envy, wishing they were occupying that seat. Few will imagine those unseen faces that truly run things from behind the facade of a throne. Public trust is the hallmark of the Donald J. Trump presidency. In fact, most presidencies incorporate public trust into their doctrine, like the chief executive officer of a corporation. The U.S. President establishes the executive policy that will be followed by functionaries in the U.S. government corporation. This is done to carry out the interest of the Board of Directors, which can be found in the international ruling body, the United Nations. However, the presidency of Donald J. Trump highlighted public trust in more ways than one, which is different from other presidencies. While others focused only on the intangible public trust, also called popular recognition, the office of President Trump also highlighted the tangible public trust of monetary value. A shot across the bow can be found in one of Trump's executive orders, which highlights the monetary and intangible public trusts. You see, in the past, other presidencies had only focused on cultivating the intangible public trust or recognition, while abusing the tangible public trust or all public monies. Now, in current times, public monies and public trust tend to concern only publicly held corporate entities. Here, the public involved is not the natural populace, although the monies for corporate public were abused for the personal interest of corporate functionaries. Meanwhile, the presidency of Donald J. Trump seeks to change the corporate public trust to a properly monetary one, meaning public monetary responsibility will be recognized as concerning the public trust versus only the intangible recognition. Clearly written by a lawyer, this context is evident in Executive Order 13770, where it states, "Establishment of a constructed trust for the benefit of the United States, requiring an accounting and payment to the United States Treasury of all money and other things of value received by or payable to the former officer or employee arising out of any breach or attempted breach of the pledge signed by the former officer or employee." Summary. Larry Diamond, in his work Facing Up to the Democratic Recession, highlights the connection between the realm of politics and the game of power. Quote, "The mainly post-communist atrocities of the Shanghai Corporation organization centered on the axis of cynical cooperation between Russia and China have become much more coordinated and assertive. Both countries have both been aggressively flexing their muscles in dealing with their neighbors on territorial questions, and increasingly they are pushing back against democratic norms by using the instruments of soft power, international media such as RT, Russia's slick 24/7 global television news channel, China's Confucius Institutes, lavish conferences, and exchange programs. Of course, the area highlighted is only one of many, and still only represents pieces on the overall game. In conclusion, if you will, we have come to understand how politics relates to chess and what purpose behind categorizing systems really is. Simply put, a political system is equivalent to a chess strategy. Bobby Fischer, the famous international champion of chess, classified chess strategy into two main categories. In paraphrasing that chess savant's words, he said that when your opponent is orderly, cause chaos, and when your opponent is chaotic, engage him in painful order. Where the categorizing of a political system governs the strategy, a political entity like a government is simply set aside on the board. The functionaries or basic workers will act as pawns. Meanwhile, chief executive officers like the chief finance officer, operating officer, or president would be found in whichever piece controls the momentum of the board, like the queen. Finally, the player of the game is mostly never seen, as people pay attention to the moves that each piece makes, rather than the mover of each piece. Finally, the corporate entity that we call government could be seen as one side of a chessboard, and the particular system employed governs the overall strategy of that side of the board. A democratic system might be seen in an offensive chess strategy, which implements a sort of controlled chaos and tries to develop multiple smaller strategies to catch the enemy off guard. Due to the nature of politics and power, the chess metaphor will be of endless usefulness when describing the political realm. References: Diamond L., Thinking About Hybrid Regimes, Journal of Democracy, the Johns Hopkins University Press. Burns L., Osage Indian Customs and Myths, University of Alabama Press and Fire Ants Books, originally published by Sager Press, copyright 1984, and 2005 first paperback edition. Trump D., 2017, January 28th, Executive Order 13770, Ethics Commitments by Executive Branch Appointees, Federal Register, Volume 82, Number 22, Friday, February 3rd, 2017. Diamond L., 2015, January, Facing Up to the Democratic Recession from the Authoritarian Resurgence, page 151. Chinese Corporate Communism in the World. A Perspective on the Geopolitical Effects of Modern Communism. Introduction. The People's Republic of China, abbreviated to the PRC, is a globally recognized and incorporated government, which is part of the United Nations. Its declared territory is likely different from what is the practical case, but one way or another it is difficult to verify the true state of the PRC today. There is much clouding of the issue, due to the heavily biased propaganda that is published by most Western outlets. Unfortunately, the so-called Western outlets constitute the main source of information, with the rest being obscure or suppressed by corporate structures. With this information, we will have to do our best, corroborated with historical and experience-based evidence. There are a number of unrecognized parts of China that could be considered autonomous zones, like the historically independent Manchurian portion of China. Manchuria bears a similar history to many historical natural republics like Texas and the Yucatan. Those that live in Texas identify with the Republic and not with the federal U.S. government, despite being incorporated as a state in the U.S. federal system. The majority of Texans resent the overreach of the U.S. corporate federal government. Similarly, the Republic of the Yucatan in Mexico was once independent, but like Texas and Manchuria, it was torn between one federal government and another. The same story will be witnessed in the short-lived Republic of Rio Grande do Sul in the southern region of Brazil, and with the Kurdish people of their unrecognized country, Kurdistan. With this global context, we can better understand the practical position of the PRC, where control is mostly relegated to large city centers, like most corporate governments. The realm that is claimed by the PRC is larger than what they practically control, based upon popular acceptance there. Evidence of this can be found in the work of Henry S. Rowan, where it states, or Rowan, education is crucial, and where China does not impress. In 2000, the country's entire over 25 population had only an average of 5.75 years of schooling, between all developing countries at 4.89 years, and the East Asia and Pacific country averaged 6.5 years. Yet large educational improvement efforts are underway, especially in rural areas and the rapidly expanding post-secondary sector. My projection is that by 2025, the average Chinese person over 25 will have had almost 8 years of formal schooling. This passage demonstrates that the PRC's socialist way of doing things is less popular in China, with a lack of popular support for their socialist school system. In a geopolitical context, there might be more general support for the PRC's system of governance than other places like territorial Ecuador. However, deduced from this author's U.S. background, there is less support in the claimed territory of China for socialism than there is in the United States. Chinese students that smoke. The Ohio State University Columbus-based campus provides the backdrop for a perplexing question. Why were Chinese students smoking on campus? The Columbus-based main campus of the Ohio State University was listed as a smoke-free campus prior to the elevation of pandemic-level lockdowns and the shutting down of in-person classes. However, at the time, in 2019, only 2 groups ignored this dictate. The first and most important group that ignored this edict consisted of military veterans, specifically those that had served on active duty. The veterans set the stage as they tended to smoke in the loading bay behind the veteran lounge. You see, the campus had a strictly arm's-length policy, practically, when it came to dealing with veterans. They wanted our money, but they did not want us. Therefore, something as simple as ignoring some non-smoking signs was markedly ignored by the university faculty. This smoking area established by veterans was enjoyed by only one other body of students, and those were those of Chinese national origin. It is illogical to say that no other students smoked, but it is telling that only veterans of active duty service and Chinese students flouted the smoke-free policy of the campus. A study about smoking in Ireland might shed some light on this question, where a questionnaire was presented to registered nurses about reasons why they smoked. According to the authors, smokers were presented with 6 statements that focused on the reasons for continuing with a habit. They were asked to rank these on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 representing not important and 10 being important. These statements were based on reasons identified from the results of earlier research studies and validated in this study's focus groups. The sample rated addiction mean score 7 to 1 to be the key reason for their smoking behavior. This was followed by environment, work, or 6-6, and work pressure, 5-3. Followed by a way to deal with anxiety and to control weight. The lowest scoring factor was influence of family and friends. Standard deviation values indicated a good spread of responses to each term. McKenna H. et al., 2001. Addiction is listed as the main reason for smoking among nurses in Ireland, tested in the study listed above. However, we can accurately say that the Chinese smoke because of addiction. This would be illogical. If smoking was prohibited in China, the second reason might be more applicable, environment or enjoyment. But this does not answer the question of why certain Chinese students specifically chose to flout university policy. Some theories may be derived, but more analysis might be required for the subject. We can accurately say that the Chinese students smoked on campus for a reason, and relegated this activity to the veteran established smoking area. In speculation, we can correlate a few theories of note. It appears there is a major consensus that socialism works, which is not a surprise, when the founder of the United Nations was a prominent member of the Belgian Workers' Party, which later came to be known as the Belgian Socialist Party. The United Nations presents the doctrine for most governments of today, and Communist China is no exception. Social behavioral norms and proper behavior outcome are some of the tenets of socialism, whether it be a corporate social democracy or a communist regime. This is highlighted in the Cardinal Principles on Secondary Education, Kingsley C. et al., 1918. The purpose of democracy is so to organize a society that each member may develop his personality primarily through activities designed for the well-being of his fellow members and society as a whole. Page 9. This definition of democracy gives us a plausible idea why these Chinese students flouted campus policy, but only did so in the area that veterans set the example. You see, In this context, the Chinese saw us, the veterans, as neighbors in the society of the campus. They witnessed the behavior being performed and registered this activity as something which was applicable to the well-being of campus society. Thus, as good members of this society, these Chinese students demonstrated a certain level of socialist acumen, different from other members of the campus. Conversely, we, the veterans, demonstrated something different. Rather than developing our personality in respect to activities of society at large, the veteran population mostly developed their personalities in relationship to the military and other military personnel. In our example, the veterans flout campus policy as a unit, since the unit is superior to any civil policy. Meanwhile, the Chinese students cannot differentiate the separate behavior of the veterans from the civilian population of the campus. So the Chinese students take their cue from what they see as equal members of society rather than members of the traditionally and practically separate behavioral norms of the military. Evidence of Chinese expansionism. The prime mark of communism today can be seen in business acquisitions. In general, it is considered that the communist system will incorporate businesses into the government or vice versa. Of course, there are just layers of separation, as the People's Republic of China is an incorporated entity like most governments. However, the major difference can be seen in the single layer of separation in the United States, where regulatory bodies form a visible layer between the corporate interests and government. This facade in the United States does provide a few benefits, as it allows a small amount of decentralization. Decentralization is the key here, as the Chinese brand of communism is highly centralized and micromanaging. The Chinese brands are blatantly government-led versus the clandestine government control in the US. In this context, the public's trust is the most important element to consider here. When the public believes that the government is not a competitor, members of the public are likely to have more courage in crafting products and baking things, or building things. Conversely, there is little incentive to do this when the government will simply push out all core competition, including the small business competition. A reduction in quality will be seen following communist acquisitions, and communist businesses usually don't create quality products, like the Chinese communist system, which is not necessarily better than a capitalist one. The micromanaging of production allows little leeway and creativity to those that do the work. Profits are maximized to those that run the business, while quality suffers. It is a commonly believed idea in most of the Americas that, quote, made in China is synonymous with bad quality. Therefore, those with an eye for quality products will specifically look for what is not made in China, let alone something sold by a Chinese brand. In combating this, the Chinese corporate structure began acquiring other brands, seeking to establish layers of separation. However, this effort did not follow the reduction in quality rule, and most US-based corporations saw a steady drop-off of customers after a Chinese-based acquisition. This element was especially apparent in the video game-oriented company that does business as Blizzard Entertainment Incorporated. The obvious Chinese involvement would be seen through their online game Hearthstone, in which a prominent player was banned for speech that was critical of China. However, further evidence supports the Chinese acquisition conclusion, as the company saw a drastic decrease in quality across all product lines. The game World of Warcraft lost a trove of loyal customers after the game controllers became too greedy, adding pay-to-play schemes, nonsensical concepts, and further actions that undermine the integrity of the game world. Solving the communist problem. The PRC might solve their image problem by embracing a quality encouragement approach. It appears that they have started to implement an attempt in the right direction by removing the labels of product origin. Unfortunately, this will not work, as it is like putting a band-aid on gangrene. This approach is the classic dictatorial tactic of censorship as a solution. This will not remove the quality concern, nor the newly cultivated bad faith image of the acquired corporations. Instead of removing the place of origin tags, the subsidiary corporations of the communist regime might place province of origin tags. Something made in the Hunan province will certainly be more appealing than made in China. Of course, ultimately, this tactic would fail if the quality issue is not addressed, which is always the proverbial thorn in the side of communist regimes. Simply put, communism and quality do not go together. They are like a snake and a mongoose. Communism is as the system is commonly seen today, is far too authoritarian and centralized to produce anything of quality. This is because quality is derived from incentive and creative freedom, something that cannot exist in the domineering communist ideology. Rivals of the PRC might gain a real edge over the Chinese acquisition if they were to focus efforts on a quality-based approach. Of course, the best way to do this would be to encourage ability cultivation and creative freedom, which is not what most competitors do today. Now, the prime opponent to communist corporatism is the small business owner, as only those on the ground level have a degree of decentralization and creative freedom. Decentralization is also necessary to combat communist acquisition, a top-down structure itself. Communist regimes require centralized structures to acquire, as it is difficult for them to attain ownership over systems with no major head. As an old proverb comes to mind when speaking on this subject, oddly enough, the PRC does not follow the basic tenets of Sun Tzu, where an army of individuals is much more powerful than any other. You see, if you fight an army with one general, then you only have one mind to contend with, and it is easier to read the strategy put forth. Conversely, an army that has many commanders, which have creative freedom in how they carry out a unified purpose, is much harder to contend with. The probability of different strategies being employed at the same time exponentially increases, with an army of creatively independent individuals. This is the very philosophy behind the small unit leadership model of the U.S. Marine Corps. The small unit leadership model means that a commander will push out a general objective, but delegate the specific strategies and tactics that will be used to carry out the overall objective. While the Chinese communists love to tout Sun Tzu as the guiding doctrine for business strategy, they ignore this basic tenet. Summary: the return of the Cold War is being presented as a likely outcome for the global future, which is most apparent in the mongering for World War III. Subsequent attempts to populate the perception of a rise in communist regimes shows us one thing. Someone wants us to believe that a Cold War 2.0 is on the horizon. There is one element of evidence that points to orchestration rather than organic elevation. Despite the massive corporate takeovers by Communist China across the globe, there has not been a proportionate influx of Chinese migration and tourism. Historically, when the United States government conquered other regions, such as with the 19th century Panama, there was a correlating migration of tourists and professionals. Instead, most Chinese migration is relegated to universities and corporate sectors, but not tourism and other migratory spheres. This evidence would lend itself to the conclusion that corporations are letting themselves be acquired as part of a global reorganization of government and corporate structure. A further piece of evidence can be found in the alleged country of Ecuador. In this small South American country, the policies of Rafael Correa brought in the great influx of Venezuelan citizens, but no Venezuelan brands became overly represented in the country. Conversely, there was a heavy influx of Chinese brands into Ecuador, like the companies Huawei and Yak Motors, or Jacques Motors, Yak's how they would say it. Such efforts present evidence of global cooperation to promote a new rise in communist doctrines. Finally, this conclusion is alluded to in The Return of Authoritarian Great Powers by Asar Ghat, in which it stated that the second and more significant challenge emanates from the rise of non-democratic great powers, the West's old Cold War rivals China and Russia, now operating under authoritarian capitalists rather than communist regimes. Authoritarian capitalist powers played a leading role in the international system up until 1945. They have been absent since then, but today they seem poised to make a comeback. Page 539. References: Rowan, H. 2007 July. When Will the Chinese People Be Free? Journal of Democracy, No. 3, National Endowment for Democracy, and the Johns Hopkins University Press. McKenna H. et al., 2001, December 20th. Qualified Nurses, Smoking Prevalence, Their Reasons for Smoking and Desire to Quit. January, Leading Global Nursing Research. Kinsley C. et al., 1918, Bulletin No. 35, Cardinal Principles of Secondary Education, a report of the Commission on the Reorganization of Secondary Education appointed by National Education Association, released by the Department of the Interior, Bureau of Education, Washington Government Printing Office. Getty, 2007, July 1st. The Return of Authoritarian Great Powers and the End of History, page 539. Elements of the Effort to Globalize: How Fiction Theory and the World Wide Web Have Captured Us. Introduction. Globalization is not a new concept, and most apparent in the immigration and visa systems today, which were flourishing in the 17th and 19th centuries respectively. Globalization elements in most aspects were categorically rejected in the Americas. However, like a patient panther, the concept of globalization continued to resurface and was eventually leveraged against us. At the heart is the desire for consolidating control over the globe into a centralized entity. Additionally, the concept of globalization has not changed all too much. In the voyage of a Spaniard through the Levant, we find an example of the visa system being practiced by the British in Gibraltar. De la Granja, J. 1827. To enter the city, they gave us residence papers for 10 days. I obtained permission from the Plaza Mayor, where the governor does not bother himself with these materials as in other parts, neither in passports nor documents of a weekly nature. His secretary puts the signature, and this is honored on all parts. Of course, the control over human movement is second to the spread of information in the eyes of the globalist conquerors. Quarantines of the healthy constitutes an old aspect of globalization efforts and is readily apparent today. It is ludicrously advised that healthy people quarantine in their homes. However, when it comes to foreign travel, quarantine of the healthy is mandatory and reaches exceptional heights of tyranny and persecution. Such procedures were practiced in the 17th century. In the Levantine adventure, The Travels and Missions of Chevalier d'Arvus, 1653 to 1697, we find an example of arbitrary quarantines for international travel. On June 21st, 1665, after an uneventful passage, d'Arvus arrived at Marseille, where he was at once incarcerated in the quarantine hospital, and there he remained until the 26th, shut in a little room without a window. With only 5 days quarantine, he was lucky, and I suspect the purser of having made a false declaration. Indeed, 5 days is a light castigation by modern standards. Instigating the crime of foreign travel, the modern offender is charged with a mandatory quarantine of at least 14 days, unless that person bows to other equally terrorizing and egregious edicts. A similar situation is found in our Spaniard through Gibraltar, De la Granja, 1827, and so ordered the doctor, keeping the cargo in 5 days of quarantine and the people 10. Page 6. It should be noted that, like today, pragmatism, symptoms, logic, or consequence of abuse mattered little when carrying out the arbitrary edicts of authoritarian globalists. The juridic person of fiction theory. A juridic person is the main entity in fiction theory, where a juridic fiction is established by the judicial courts of today. It is especially well defined by a professor on the subject, the esteemed Professor Settimio Caridi wrote in a declaration to the U.S. District Court of Northern California, quote, "A juridic person is a fictitious rather than a natural person, and is similar to a corporation that is created for some particular purpose as may be defined in the founding documents and further elaborated in its bylaws, describing the corporate structure and function. Like the common law corporation, the juridic person is a legal mechanism through which organizations maintain a separate identity, structure, purpose, and legal independence." 26. Juridic persons are also classified as either public or private. With this definition, we find that our courts practicing fiction theory recognize unnatural entities as people. Therefore, perhaps our incorporated governments are people, as are any separate juridical entities that are formed by them. In fact, the alphabet company and holding companies might be considered people. Who knows how many subsidiary corporations are legally recognized as sovereign individuals? Equally absurd, imagine that all of these corporations constitute the public interest, since many are listed as public. These legal people could easily outweigh the voice of natural-born people, thus establishing majority rule of fictitious entities, which are all controlled by the same person that can write enough founding documents or bylaws. This is the global situation that we face today and has been brought about by the implementation of fiction theory. Fiction theory has completely removed the issues of natural democracy and placed an unnatural one into its position. Instead of a democracy that is run by natural-born people, instead inherently problematic, we have a democracy that is run by juridical people, for a juridical public interest, in a world of juridical fiction. So what is fiction theory? Simply put, Fiction theory governs the concept of taking fiction and manifesting it into reality. The first and most important mechanism for implementing fiction into reality is language. However, instead of using language for simple regurgitation of mindless propaganda, a different sort of spell is woven. Among the most disturbing elements of fiction theory and globalist practitioners, the concerted effort to manifest apocalyptic events into reality is special. This starts with dishonest use of language, such as the formulation of labels and stigma, especially in an effort to socially modify behavior. However, there is a physical component to instigating the fictional apocalypse into reality. There is a large deal of evidence to suggest that treatment of wartime veterans can be used as an example in this regard. First, the establishment of the post-traumatic stress disorder issue is created through propagating and educating the symptoms. Then, certain groups are listed as having tendencies towards such problems, like veterans returning from combat. When it comes to this alleged illness, violence and suicide are specifically amplified, as with the promotion of the Christopher Dorner story, the quote, cop killing cop, where military service was highlighted. However, when we dive deeper into the subject, we find that mefloquine was the driving physical compound to institute this theory of violent veterans and manifest it into reality. Poisoning and contamination have long been central elements in the globalists' fiction theory. Such documentation can be found that points to Venetian merchants selling contaminated cattle into Renaissance Italy, causing illness and disease that was attributed to the so-called Black Death. Furthermore, cholera was discovered to originate from a contaminated water supply in Victorian-era England, after a surgeon realized that brewers were the only group in the city of London that had not gotten sick. Among the numerous examples of these concerted efforts in the physical realm, we find Operation Midnight Climax, where Gottlieb, a Nazi scientist and agent of the Central Intelligence Agency, studied the behavioral effects of drugs by dosing citizens of San Francisco without their knowledge. Also, we can look to Operation LAC, or LAC, where zinc cadmium sulfide was sprayed out over St. Louis and other areas. Of course, LAC stands for Location Area Code in cellular parlance, but it is alleged that it stands for Large Area Coverage in this operation. In addition, as far as the U.S. is concerned, we can look to Operation Big Buzz, Operation Dropkick, and Operation Sea Spray, among others, as physical occurrences that sought to implement a fictional apocalypse into reality, which is a horrid consequence of current globalist influence, with the main objective of depopulating the planet, a talking point of the overpopulation movement. Lined with statistics and other dishonest ways of using numbers, or failing to properly verify the validity of numbers, have led to fantasy realm and reality, where people believe that it is normal to be sick and the world is an extremely hostile place, always trying to eradicate humanity. The propaganda that either lies with statistics or uses faulty numbers establishes a state of fear among the global populace. Among other motives, this greatly impacts the profit margin of health systems, but also gives control over to the very entities that propagate this state of fear. The first way this is done is through statistics, and a bold-faced lie is easy to conjure when it is often done. An example of this is in Ohio during the year 2020, when all news outlets published the fiction of hospitals being stretched to capacity. However, after an in-person review of hospitals in the central region, this narrative was found to be utterly false, as not only were the hospitals not over capacity, but they appeared to be closed, with the lights off and no vehicles in the parking lots. Of course, a much harder to detect method of lying with numbers is the use of faulty ones, which has mostly been the case. If we take our case of the Black Death fiction, we find that many in the Middle Ages had incentives to lie, especially poor country lords that desired to be left alone. Naturally, there is the element of intentional poisoning and incorporating those cases into the Black Death numbers, but an easy example is more prevalent today. Sick call, or calling in sick, is almost universally known as the only way to get out of work, yet this does not stop medical propagandists from using these corporate sick call numbers as a method to tout their cure-all snake oil, which arguably causes more damage. Either way, while the wicked continue to rule in this way, there is truly no hope for humanity, as a statement in the movie Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers is applicable, said by King Theoden of Rohan, "What can men do against such reckless hate?" The Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN. The Internet domain is something that makes a website, and it is required for everyone that operates in the World Wide Web, which is most people. However, the Internet domain is not necessarily owned by anyone. At least, it is not owned in the common sense of the word. While an internet domain is a component of fiction theory, something that is fictional but manifested into reality, one entity controls every internet domain. When building a website, the constructor rents a domain from a service. In turn, that service will rent their domain from ICANN. This is a multi-layered system that provides a lever over every single website that exists across the globe. Any site can be removed by the central administrator of the domain. Therefore, none are free across the internet, which means that net neutrality was achieved in the sense that none are free to do as they please. The internet is controlled for all, and this was the design of the net neutrality policy that was carried out by the US government. Of course, another consequence of this setup, other than complete domination of the internet, is that a huge profit margin is unfairly collected by a single entity. This by most is considered an unfair advantage in business, or perhaps a monopoly, but definitely tyranny. World of Warcraft and EVE Online are examples among many of how fictional online reality has been manifested into reality. The fictional realm has been manifested into reality. However, the company TikTok can be seen as one of the most effective globalist tools for doing this. TikTok is the reason why the letters ACAB, A-C-A-B, can be found in cities across the world, as in Quito, Cancun, and Columbus, among almost every other. The letters ACAB denote an English phrase, which begs the question, why does graffiti in Spanish-speaking countries contain these letters? The complicated answer is to name the involvement of globalists. But the simple answer is to point to the application of TikTok. When it comes to TikTok, which is a social media outlet that shares short videos, and it was used to implement an element of fiction theory that uses trigger words. Trigger words are designed to elicit a certain response. In this context, a word forms a trigger like that of a gun. This trigger, once used, will activate those that are correlated with it, eliciting the response that is programmed into their social behavior. The most obvious use of this trigger word theory is encapsulated in the phrase Black Lives Matter, which was used to elicit fear, incite fear, and violence across the globe via the application TikTok. Also, as an added note, application is usually a word that denotes something that is applied. So most of us have applications on phones that are applied. Interesting. Food for thought. In continuation, however, with our examples of World of Warcraft, WoW, and EVE Online, we find a different dynamic. This is the one where people retreat from physical reality and adopt the fictional reality of online worlds. In EVE Online, an enormous economy, possibly the largest in the world, is formed by players that spend their lives in a fictional space-based realm. Here, real money is exchanged into in-game currency, and billions of dollars are spent on building enormous fictional spacecraft. Conversely, World of Warcraft shows a different element of this blurring of reality and fiction, when a virtual blood virus was spread across the platform, infecting player accounts with a debilitating virtual disease. The entire online game had to be reset. This, of course, was an indicator of the Great Reset, a depopulation campaign launched by globalists which continues today. Summary: the rules of the game have been changed by globalists recently, but simply looking at the rules of politics in this manner is rudimentary. Some might argue that nothing has changed, whether it be the Sanhedrin, Pharisees, or Sadducees of the Bible. The quest for domination and control has been at the heart of politics. Therefore, with this in mind, the rules of the game have always revolved around this equilibrium. Therefore, the game of power has not changed, and the globalists simply attempt to carry out the same objective. That being said, globalists and fiction theory have dynamically changed the idea of natural republics and self-governance, reverting the state of the globe back to a pre-feudal period. What we see today in globalists is a modern Roman Empire reborn. This is nothing new, as the fascists, socialists, Napoleonic followers, communist national assemblies, academicians, revolutionaries, anarchists, and conquistadors are examples of groups working together trying to establish the global Roman Empire, which is apparent in their imagery, use of Greco-Roman design in buildings, crests, logos, and clothing. There has mostly been a Greco-Roman equilibrium to globalist efforts, which contain the oldest of objectives and consistently seek to conquer others. Stanley Hoffman asked a very important question in Clash of Globalizations, Hoffman S. 2002. What concepts help explain the new global order? page 510. The answer to this question is simple: the old one. The old global order is the same as the new one and has not changed all that much. As with the double faces of Janus, we must look to the past in order to see the future. Knowing this brings one thing to mind. In the Marine Corps doctrine of maneuver warfare, it is specified that an enemy's equilibrium must be identified and then destroyed. Only after this will victory be achieved. References de la Granja J. 1827, personally translated from the Spanish. Viaje de un Español por el Levante. Published Broad Street, number 46, New York, from page 6 and 7, chapter 1. Lewis, W.H., 1963, first American edition, Levantine Adventure, The Travels and Missions of Chevalier de Rue, 1653 to 1697, printed in Holland by Ducari, Holland, N.V., Amsterdam. Well, that's Ducari. I don't remember how to say that. Caridi S. 2006, March 20th. Declaration of Professor Settimio Cardignani Caridi in support of the defendant IOR's motion to dismiss Fourth Amended Complaint for lack of subject matter jurisdiction. United States District Court, Northern District of California. Emil Alpirin et al. Versus Vatican Bank, aka Institute of Religious Works or Instituto per le Opere di Religione. IOR et al. Case number C99-04941 MMC-EDL. Hoffman S. 2002, July through August. Clash of Globalizations from Foreign Affairs 81, number 4, pp. 104 through 15. Lack of legitimacy in a corporate democracy. A cursory analysis of how the Republic of Ecuador, of the Equator, struggles with recognition. Introduction. The Republic of Ecuador is a small government in South America that is consistently embroiled in conflict. The Ecuadorian situation is not dissimilar to what many states in the U.S. face today. The word Ecuador is Spanish and means the equator, where Ecuador is located. Nominally, the government of Ecuador has control over three main regions: the coast, the Sierra or mountains, and a portion of the Amazon forest. Within the Sierra region is the city of Quito. The middle of the world is alleged to be situated at latitude 0000. Analysis of the geopolitical situation here is complicated, both practically and in legal theory, which requires experiential-based understanding. However, first, we must define our terms and decide what we mean when we say the government of Ecuador enjoys split legitimacy. Legitimacy. The legitimacy of governance can be defined as recognition toward a governing entity. If the power of an entity is recognized, it could be stated that a high level of legitimacy is enjoyed. Conversely, little recognition means practically that the entity has no real legitimacy. Paraphrasing the textbook, Max Weber defines legitimacy into three categories: traditional, charismatic, and legal, rational authority. Basically, the traditional form of authority involves legitimacy through practice. It has always existed. Conversely, the legitimacy of charisma governs the recognition that an entity holds through perception or showmanship. The last of these three is called legitimacy by legal authority, or the legal rationale, which could be considered legitimacy through administration, established through the judicial procedure and documentation. However, these types of legitimacy can be considered as subsections of the overall definition of legitimacy, a concept which we will explore further in relation to the entity known as the Republic of Ecuador. When discovering the definition and concept of legitimacy, we can turn to a very useful source, the Levantine Adventure, The Travels and Missions of the Chevalier d'Arvus, 1653 to 1697, by Warren H. Lewis. When speaking of the unrecognized Republic of Tunis, we gain an idea of what it looks like when an entity enjoys no legitimacy. On page 117, W. H. Lewis writes, "Nominally, it was a province of the Ottoman Empire, and as such was supposed to be ruled by a pasha appointed by the Sultan. But in fact, it was a military republic governed by its army and the pasha, though treated with the greatest deference, had not even a seat in the divan or council of the state." And the pasha, though treated with the greatest deference, had not even a seat in the divan or council of state. The only recognition he received as governor was that he was allowed to transmit certain monies to the Sultan, and that his signature was appended to all decrees and the instruments of the divan, as one of his executive functions that of being escorted once a week by the whole divan to the public prayer and then back to his official residence, which he was not allowed to leave without permission from the Dey. The Dey is the elected head of the Divan, or Council of State. Lewis W.H., 1963. Legitimacy of Ecuador. The Republic of Ecuador, while not independent of the United Nations, is considered to be legally independent of the bordering incorporated governments of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. Despite this, the Colombian armed forces have made repeated raids into the Ecuadorian Amazon in pursuit of members of the alleged Communist Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, las FARC, las Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia. Such excursions could be seen as a lack of recognition of legitimacy by the Colombian armed forces, as far as the legitimacy of the Ecuadorian government is concerned. In fact, the Ecuadorian government enjoys almost no presence in its Amazon region, and lacks any semblance of legitimacy in this area, which is, in practicality, an autonomous region that is controlled there by the Amazon Indians that live there. The raid by the Colombian armed forces, demonstrating their lack of attention to the government of Ecuador's legitimacy, is explained in a report, Right 3H 2013. In addition to a Colombian Special Forces raid on a FARC base within Ecuadorian territory, despite international uproar, brought to the forefront of the world's attention for the first time, the support of regional populist governments had allegedly been providing, in particular the governments of President Rafael Correa in Ecuador and President Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. The Sierra region of Ecuador could be seen as the major split, dividing the practically autonomous Amazon region from the completely governed coast. Through personal experience, it can be said that life in the split region and the autonomous region is superior to the governed region. In the Sierra region, the Ecuadorian government retains moderate control over the cities and motorways. However, when the Indians of the Amazon and the surrounding countryside descend upon the cities and motorways, the government loses all control. This is where the split comes in, as dominance over the region is split between the people of Ecuador and its incorporated government. Naturally, in such a disputed territory, conflict occurs often, specifically between the people outside the cities and agents of the government that try to claim governance over the rest of the territory. Historically, disputed territories have always been a hotbed of conflict. The coastal region of Ecuador includes the capital city of Guayaquil, which seems to dominate the coast. Furthermore, while Quito is listed as capital of the Ecuadorian government, Guayaquil is the practical capital of the country. When compared to the Sierra region, life in the coast is extremely oppressive and can be felt in the mannerisms of the people. As with the northeast coast of the United States, Ecuadorians of the coast have very different manners when compared to their counterparts in the mountains. People on the coast are more direct and off-putting, while those of the Sierra are more relaxed and peaceful. Also, products on the coast are more expensive, where taxes are higher and the laws of the government are more oppressive, as with the northeast coast of the United States. Finally, Guayaquil has the only legally recognized firearms store in the country. Attempts to establish legitimacy. The building of a main highway through the Sierra region of Ecuador was one of the few successful efforts by the government of Ecuador to increase legitimacy in the region. Of course, one objective of this highway construction holds the same roots as the highway systems in the United States and the world. All highways retain the objective of controlling movement and establishing the dominance of oil as an economic mechanism. In the past, the government of Ecuador enjoyed little petroleum-based control in the Sierra region. This is because most travel is done via horse and mule, as is still practiced by many today, despite the prevalence of the central highway system. Furthermore, when the Indians of the surrounding area shut down the highway system in acts of civil disobedience called the paro, control via petroleum was all but removed. This loss of control leads to a violent confrontation as the government forces attempt to remove indigenous highway obstruction, which often leads to murder of members of the populace. The violence perpetrated at the hands of the government officials further embed the resentment that the local populations hold, and increases resistance, thus diminishing the legitimate control that the government enjoys. The Saving Face project of then-President Rafael Correa, known as the Yasuni ITT Initiative, is one of many examples of failed efforts by the Ecuadorian government to establish legitimate rule in the region. This project, led by Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garces, who served as President of the United Nations in 2018, had the conservation of petroleum in the Yasuni National Park as its stated purpose. According to an article, Maximiliano Proaño at energytransition.org, in 2007, former President Rafael Correa offered to leave the oil in the ground in return for $3.6 billion compensation from the global community. This money was to be invested in renewable energy protection of biodiversity and conservation of 44 protected areas with this project, which was linked to the National Plan for Living Well, Buen Vivir. Ecuador was moving toward a post-petroleum based society and the pursuit of better living standards. However, in 2013, the plan was scrapped by Correa's government on the grounds that the international community had not paid enough to compensate Ecuador. Summary: the Republic of Ecuador suffers from very low legitimacy in its alleged total territory of dominance. In actuality, as with the District of Columbia in the United States, the practical area of control, where the Ecuadorian government enjoys legitimate rule, is much smaller and mostly relegated to the coastal region. Most efforts by the Ecuadorian government to expand legitimacy have failed and have been marked by an oppressive violence instituted against the population of the Sierra. This violence has further seeded a deep hatred and resentment toward the government of Ecuador and further seeded legitimacy of rule among the populace of the Sierra. References: O'Neill P. 2022, 7th edition, or 2020, 7th edition. Essentials of Comparative Politics, W.W. Norton Company. Lewis, Warren H. 1963, First American Edition, 11th Adventure, Travels and Missions of Chevalier d'Arvus, 1653 to 1697. Printed in Holland by Druckerij, Holland N.V. Amsterdam. Wright III, H. MSc, 2013, May 21st, Islamic Terrorism in South America, Evaluation and Recommended Actions. Proaño M. 2019, February 6th. The End of Buen Vivir. Ecuador plans oil extraction in Usuni National Park from energy transition. The Global Energy Wende, an initiative of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Thank you, and if you have enjoyed this video and liked this content, please check out all the other things I have published, including my writing content, and there are free books available. As always, stay tuned, there will be more.